Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week, we've seen the heat build back into western Nebraska. Relatively cool conditions here in eastern Nebraska, although we started to see the warmth move in during the latter half of the week. And of course, we've seen the thunderstorm development, particularly as we got into Thursday morning and through Friday morning, where we had thunderstorm development move across extreme northeastern Nebraska with some isolated pockets Thursday morning in eastern Nebraska, and then overall we had that broad-based widespread precipitation move from central Nebraska through the eastern part of the state during the overnight hours into Friday morning. And then if we went into last weekend, of course, we had that cold front that pushed through that brought the cooler air into eastern Nebraska. We actually had some reports of scattered frost in the northern Black Hills and then up into portions of western South Dakota, western North Dakota, and the front range of the Rockies in the Montana region. So it's a reminder that we're getting closer and closer to that eventual first freeze of the year. There is nothing really coming down the pipeline that we can see, at least in the immediate future. But the one thing that we did notice over this last couple of weeks was exceptionally cool conditions invaded a good broad portion of the upper Midwest, including Nebraska, where we ran anywhere from 6 degrees below normal to 10 degrees below normal on average temperatures, and that actually pushed back our expected development or maturity of our corn crop. We've been tracking this now for the past month, and initial suggestions were indicating the last 2 weeks of September for the vast majority of the corn crop actually got pushed back 4 or 5 days due to this cool weather. Now, as we go through the next 2 weeks, it looks like much above normal temperatures. That'll probably offset the cool conditions that we've seen, because it does appear that average temperatures will remain in the area of 6 to maybe even up to 12 degrees above normal over this next 7 to 10 day period, and we should pretty much balance things out. So again, we're still projecting most of the crop will mature during the latter half of September. The only item that we do worry about is some of the late plant or replant corn that may be pushing the threshold in the middle of maturity to the middle of October, which will put us in to that 50-50 freeze risk, especially if you're in the northern half of the state. Now, as we go through this next 7 day period, of course, we had the precipitation move through. It does look like a warming conditions will start to build in across the Midwest, and that will expand toward the eastern United States. And we don't really see a lot of significant moisture until we get into the latter half of next week. So let's take a look at the upper end models and see how this is going to play out. Once again, we have this broad-based ridge that's going to build in, and that's going to bring the heat basically from the southwest, from the southern plains up into the central United States. We'll be looking at conditions here in eastern Nebraska that will be slightly cooler than western Nebraska, as we are on the front side of this ridge that will slowly expand toward the east. So we'll be looking at consistently probably upper 80s today across northern Nebraska, particularly northeast Nebraska, eastern Nebraska. As we get into western Nebraska, we'll be looking well into the lower to mid 90s. As we go into tomorrow, we'll see that that ridge starts to expand toward the east. You'll notice this trough up in the Pacific Northwest. It doesn't really do much here for the next few days as it remains parked because of this high blocking it. And as we get into Monday, again, that ridge starts to slowly slide, and we will probably be looking at temperatures approaching the upper 90s in the western part of the state, particularly in the northern half of the Panhandle, and the low 90s will be consistent across the eastern part of the state. There is some outside precipitation showing up inside the models, very isolated across the Panhandle as some of this monsoon moisture makes its way into the Panhandle. More importantly, as we get into Tuesday, it does appear that this ridge will sag far enough eastward to allow us a little bit of the cooler air from the Pacific Northwest into the northern Panhandle, and that may generate some isolated scattered thunderstorm activity during the overnight hours, and it will carry that into Wednesday with the shift of the precipitation more into central Nebraska, but again, it's going to be very isolated. The hurricane that was down in the southeastern United States, depending on the models, is going to come in somewhere between Florida and Cape Hatteras. The big question is this going to come inshore, or is this going to curve toward the Atlantic and just basically brush the eastern United States? Stay tuned, because it will change rather dramatically as we go through the next couple days. Now, as we get into Thursday, we'll start to see this trough making its way toward our region. That's going to push some of the scattered thunderstorm activity into eastern Nebraska, but again, it's going to be isolated. And as we get into Friday, we'll be looking at more of that energy coming into our region as the risk shifts to our east. As we look at the temperature forecast, you can see very warm conditions for pretty much the entire state, much above normal, with that scattering of thunderstorm activity. As we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast next Thursday through the following Tuesday, the warm conditions continue, and in terms of precipitation, we are looking at normal to above normal moisture.